Today's episode is the first part of a two-part conversation where Chris and I speak with Catherine Zakoian, and we talk about working with Dabrowski's theory and practice, both studying the theory and working with it in a clinical practice. We talk about emotional tension and the shadow, not only how this applies to an individual but also in groups, including families and groups studying the theory. Catherine shares some of her practice in working with gifted kids and their families, so whether you're working with clients yourself, starting to study the theory, working with your own therapist, or just working on yourself, you'll find something worthwhile in these episodes. G'day listeners, and welcome back to Positive Disintegration. I'm your host Emma Nicholson, and with me is co-host Dr. Chris Wells. Hi Chris.
Hi Emma, nice to see you again.
You too. What are we talking about today?
Today I think that we're going to have an amazing conversation about using the theory in clinical practice.
So this is going to be of interest to a lot of people who are both in practice and maybe attending therapy or counselling themselves.
Definitely, yes.
Cool. Well, let's jump straight into it. Our guest today is Catherine Zakoian. Catherine's a counsellor in Boulder, Colorado. For the past 22 years, she's specialised in counselling gifted, 2E, and profoundly gifted children, teens, adults, families and organisations. Her educational consulting work provides guidance to schools serving gifted and 2E populations, and she's the author of Raising Gifted Children, a practical guide for parents facing big emotions and big potential. Welcome to the podcast, Catherine.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I wish that I had taken time before now today to articulate concisely how we know each other, but I'm going to do the best I can. I guess initially we met at the Congress in Calgary in 2016. At least that's the first time I saw you. I'm sure I remember, I'm sure that we sat together at a table at least once because we had Frank and Nancy and Linda in common, they were the only people I knew at that point. And so I was kind of sticking around them. And I was also, of course, trying to, meet new people. But then we really got to know each other in the Dabrowski study group, which started in September 2016, which is so hard to believe. But it's been such a pleasure to get to know you that way. It's hard for our listeners to know what we're talking about, but for 3 years, more than that, we met monthly, almost every month at Betty Maxwell's apartment in Denver. And then because of COVID, we've had to shift to meeting on Zoom, which was a blessing and a curse because it was so wonderful to go and hang out at Betty's place and be in person once a month. But by doing it via Zoom, we've been able to have people from out of state and even out of the country join us. So it's been really special.
Agreed. I know, Chris, I'm so glad to know you in this world. And sometimes I feel like in the Dabrowski study group, I look up whether we're in person or on Zoom, and we're both kind of sometimes in the same place, it feels like, or sort of backing up one another's thinking. And it's just been so fun to get to know you in that way. And you've also just helped me as a scholar. You've given me so much help and guidance, and I really appreciate that.
Oh, well, thank you. I totally feel aligned with all of that. It's been so special. And I agree that we're often on the same page about things, which is cool. I don't know. It's been such a journey. When I think about when we were first meeting in those first couple of years, and I would feel this intense urgency because I just was like, what are we going to do? There are problems, this field is trying to drive the theory out, and come on, people, wake up.
I remember that you were on fire. And then, meanwhile, I was kind of over in my part of the room, just trying to get my arms around just the basics of the theory, which I have to say I'm still working on, but I can remember those days. And, sitting with people who've been doing this work with the theory for so many more years. It was really wonderful to be included in that fold. I thought your spirit was fantastic. I was glad you were there.
Well, thank you. There were definitely moments where I was like, am I annoying you people? Sorry. There were definitely moments where I'm like, yeah, we're not on the same page.
Yeah, but where you took that impulse, I mean, look right from that point in in the history of your work with Dabrowski to where you are now. I mean, I think that maybe even we could say tension, right? Like just move the needle. I mean, you've got the Dabrowski Center, you're working in different circles and in different ways and with different individuals and just kind of holding the flame and the torch, as are you, Emma. And it's just really cool to see.
Well, thanks for being a part of it. It's been such a pleasure. I have never asked you. It'll be interesting to hear your answer to how you first learned about the theory, because, when we met, I had only discovered it like a couple years before. And by the time we met, I was only like a year into really digging in and committing to it. But how did you first learn about the theory?
So let's see. I'm embarrassed to say that I can't pinpoint when I first heard of the theory, and I which is kind of unusual for me, but I really can't. I've got a couple of places where I think it happened. One was in 2005. I went to a open house event at the Rocky Mountain School for the Gifted and Creative. That was a school Barb Mitchell-Hutton founded here in Boulder, and I think it was Susan Daniels, and she was speaking, and I feel like she introduced the overexcitabilities to the room in her presentation. But then I was thinking it might have been Patty Gatto-Walden, because I went to her when I was a young clinician, 2001, to ask her to help me understand children's spiritual experiences, because I'd been involved in a community crisis as an intern. Our regional mental health center was assisting with the aftermath. And as a result, I ended up becoming a grief specialist with children at that time. And sort of simultaneously, I opened my private practice, maybe after my internship, and a lot of gifted families were coming to me, even though I wasn't advertising that as a specialty. So Patty may have been the one that introduced me to Michael's work and also theory, but I'm not positive. I wish I could tell you. I feel a little sad about it, actually. It's a lost piece of my history with the theory.
But it's understandable, to be honest. I mean, I don't think we can't always know like the exact moment. And we just had this. I think Tracy Winter also, when we had her on, she was like, I can't pinpoint the exact moment. And that's okay.
I can tell you, though, like an important moment in my work, my understanding of the theory, or my attempt to understand the theory, happened when I went to the Congress in 2014. And it had been in Denver, I think, in 2012, but I wasn't able to go to that. But I went to it was in Canmore in Alberta in 2014. And I went to the opening talk, and I remember Bill Tillier saying something like, if you want to understand this theory, you have to be an archaeologist and you have to read the source documents. And these are some of my words, not his, but and that's how you understand the theory, not through a side door like the overexcitabilities. And again, that's sort of my remembrance and my words, but that had made an impression on me. And I came back to Colorado, and I thought to myself, I'm only going to do that for a while. I'm not going to be reading the blogs or some of other people's interpretation of the theory until I've read some of it more myself. And that was a huge moment for me. And then, of course, like Linda Silverman and like her crew at the Gifted Development Center, started to help me just have access to some of the materials that were very helpful. So that to me feels like more of my initiation into the theory than the earlier conversations, although I think, to answer your question, that's when I first started.
That's so funny, because I do feel like that was a bit of our tension maybe too in those early days of the study group, because you were that was your point of view, like talking about Dabrowski. And I don't necessarily want to talk about Michael's work, because for me, I was like at this point where I was just getting to know Michael in 2016. And so I was very keen to talk with the group about like his work. But for the group, they were ready to dive back into the original work along with you. And so I can appreciate now how important that was for them. It was kind of like going back to how it all started in some ways, I think.
Yes. And I remember at the time I had like a parent group to study Dabrowski and the theory. And I had an old copy I had got online, and I would read to them. I would read to the parents, and then we'd talk. And I just made us stay with the text, and it worked out. And at the same time, now I think it's so funny because now when I go to that study group, I still know I have a lot to learn, but I feel like I'm bringing in other stuff that's important to me that I think fits. Like I'm always bringing in the shadow. Like, what about the shadow?
Tell us about your work as a clinician, you're a counselor, and how the theory has informed your practice. And I realize that that is like a huge question to try and answer. So feel free to attack it from any way you'd like.
Sure. Thanks. So, in graduate school, part of the process is hopefully understanding and applying theoretical approaches, and becoming really clear about who you are and who you're not as a clinician. And so I resonated quite a bit with humanism, and particularly Carl Rogers, where, it's a lot of reflective conversation. The client has their own kind of answers or medicine within that comes forward. And then also Virginia Satir's work that has a lot to do with sort of the family dynamics. And then I loved Harry Stack Sullivan's work, even though he wasn't necessarily a big part of my training. I just love the idea of the environment sort of shaping personality. And as I was thinking about it today, I was like, that kind of in some ways represents a bit of, I think, Dabrowski's like 3 factors in some ways. And so when I started to learn about Dabrowski, I just felt some nice resonance there, because there was an honoring of the environment. There was an honoring of the sort of biological components, which, we know now also creates like genetically some of the personality components. And then sort of this thrust or this inner knowing, like 3rd factor, or the part of us that keeps moving. And then in addition to that, I did some intensive training with Violet Oaklander, who's the theorist behind Gestalt play therapy, which is really beautiful model. It's not a traditional model where, you're sitting in front of a dollhouse, let's say, and there's a mom doll and a dad doll and, a child doll. It's not really that. It's more using symbolic means to give children opportunities to explore and express who they are, who they're not, what's important to them, what's not important to them, what they wish for themselves in their life. And it's a really great model for the gifted population, and choice exceptional population, because it's really clean. The child is coming up with their own symbolic meaning, but I'm giving them opportunities to sort out the complexity of their inner world through symbols that we're working with. So that might be like animal imagery for some children. For others, it might be working with something like a tarot deck, where there's a symbol that represent these different parts of ourselves. And there's tension in the parts. There's parts that we love about ourselves and parts that we love less. And having those parts dialogue and resource one another and integrate with one another. It's a very, very clean, beautiful model that works. And there's resonance with Dabrowski there, I feel like, too. There's like this constant tension that you're working with in the Gestalt model that to me feels like that inner tension, as well as the inner to the outer world tension that Dabrowski, honors. Well, I've woven in a couple more things. I'm really interested in Carl Jung's work. I'm very, very fascinated with the shadow. Yeah, so my one sort of place in the theory where I'm not sure where I haven't woven it into my clinical practice completely, because I don't understand at the higher levels. I mean, I understand the idea that maybe we've dismissed the shadow right when we get to our personality ideal, but the idea of that self-perfection coupled with the idea of like disidentifying with sort of the lower parts, to me, I don't know if that's actually possible, even at those higher levels. But that could certainly just be a product of, I know we talk about this in our group sometimes, where people who don't understand the theory sometimes because they can't grasp some parts of it. It doesn't fit with their schema. So I wonder sometimes about that. If just these higher places, I can't see them without shadow because I can't comprehend the higher view. Does that make sense?
It does, but like, I think I've thought about this because this has totally come up during the group, and I feel like this is the kind of thing that I kept to myself probably, but I think that it has to be a process of getting to a place where you recognize your shadow, you have done that work, like, I feel very much like a part of my personal process of development has been learning to recognize my shadow, to see it when it's like arising in my life because something's happening, embracing these parts of myself and having self-compassion, knowing that this is a part of me too, not rejecting it or pretending like it doesn't exist. But you're right that this is not something that was made explicit in the theory. And I think it's partly because we only have so much written work from him. If he could have written as much as somebody who hadn't had so much struggle and being displaced, and just the circumstances of his life that were tragic in many ways, it impacted his ability to do the uninterrupted work that you want a scholar like that to be able to do, and so I feel in some ways like we don't have as much English work as we deserve from him. There is a lot of Polish work that we haven't had a chance to even explore yet.
Yes.
But that means that those answers may be somewhere.
Yes.
And they may even be, in one of the Chainin books or something. And I just haven't made this connection yet. But I agree with you that this is a very interesting thing to explore. And it's also interesting to explore the shadow of the theory itself and the people involved in it.
Yes, I agree with you, and I hope it's there, and I hope that it's unearthed and translated, because it just is so much of the human experience to have the shadow, and it's such a gold mine, right, to work with the shadow, because it'll bring us into alignment with ourselves and that sort of higher, more highly developed self because of the experience of working with the shadow. But and just coming back to your comment about the theory, I remember when I first was like getting more into the larger circles, I was like, there's some shadow, like any organized process, any systemic circle. And I am really curious about that. And I'm just wondering if there's anyone out there who like tracks that or, formally or informally. I mean, I just get little snippets here and there, but I find that really fascinating because there has been some disruption here and there, and some disagreement. And sometimes I'm not making that wrong or bad. I just wonder if that's the theory at work, right? The tension within the theory.
It's a good question about who maybe has tracked this over time or who has given this some thought. I mean, it's really interesting. And there's a whole history here that we came to, later after other people had already been kind of entrenched in working with the theory. And so It's been an interesting part of the journey just to try and figure out these things like, for me, as you know, I mean, I've done a lot of interviews asking people about Michael and his work and what he's like as a person, but that has also opened me up to fascinating conversations with people who have studied the theory for years, people who even worked with Dabrowski, like Dexter Amend, and so it's been, I mean, gosh, every time I get to talk to Dexter, it's like a gold mine of fascinating stuff being opened up from the past.
But like, I remember being at a Congress and there was like, hey, we've got boxes of material in someone's garage. Like, what are we going to do with this? There's because it's a living theory, there wasn't maybe a succession plan, or maybe there was, but is that what's happening now? And what about like the new thinkers? I've heard that term neo-Dabrowski. Like, where does that fit? Does it fit? Is the tension in the theory itself and the circle of practitioners and scholars, is that tension moving the theory into a higher place? And is
oh
all
gosh.
right in the world? Oh, what? Go ahead.
You just made me think that we're also dealing with this same problem of not facing the shadow or not resolving conflicts maybe in a vertical way. All of this also applies to the field of gifted education.
Oh, I know. It's like, yes, yes.
Like
It's
more
like,
broadly, like there are whole fields that don't seem to have examined their own experiences of tension and how to resolve conflicts instead of recycling them for decades.
yes. I think about that a lot because, and this is what I've come up with. I think there's that acute level of perfectionism in the gifted field. And I think it somehow becomes more available to us when we're in conferences and we're all together. And because we are empathic, whether or not that's conscious or not. And I think we come together and there's just sort of this edginess that can happen. And there's certainly a couple of camps, like in my book, I talk a little about the confusion and just defining the term gifted. Right? There's not even really consensus around that. Achievement versus whole child, as an example. So yeah, Chris, I mean, we haven't found our way out of that. We haven't found that vertical solution. Wouldn't that be meaningful at conferences to have like drop-in think tanks that like think about this and work on it experientially?
Totally.
Isn't this sort of like what Kate talked about when we had her speaking about disintegration in organisations, where when new bits of information come in, when new people come in, they bring with them their perspectives and their values. She was talking about in a business where the founders who have the original idea, the employees and the stakeholders that come in afterwards might have a different value and a different vision and a different set of needs, and the group has to figure out how to meet all those needs and the shifting values. So it can't just be what originally started. There has to be some sort of awareness with everybody that as the makeup of any group shifts, even as the individuals within that group grow, that the dynamics, the values and, even the perceptions and that are all going to change. We sort of see groups or companies or even a theory as like this solid, stable thing that's never going to shift, when in reality, the more that people work with it, the more people that come to it, it's inevitably going to change. I think we forget that sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, Emma. And it's a human theory, right? So there's just the mess of that, that sort of rounded mess of being human, that's very earthbound. And then there's the part of us, right, that's more lofty. And how do we find that middle ground together?
And that's maybe why, the shadow will never go away, because if we're continually got a growth mindset and we're always learning, it's a cycle of rediscovering and testing out new ground.
Yes. I have worked before. I had this one consulting project that was so meaningful for me when it was really hard to leave. And finally, after 9 years, I was like, yep, I think I want to step out because it would be more helpful to do that. And it was really hard to do because it was such a fun place. It was like a living laboratory, and we did things like this. It was an organization that served teenagers that were at risk for a variety of reasons. It was considered kind of a place where kids who were going to drop out or had dropped out could go and sort of reset their compass. And I helped the organization sort of put some things in motion to just sort of be able to have a good structure that could hold all that came with that to our school. And some of the things we did were very interesting and looked at the shadow. Like as staff, we looked at ourselves and we kind of called each other out. Like, for example, we talked about which of the students we identified with most and which of the students we pushed away from, which is almost always an indication of our shadow, right? And then when we were in relationship that was breaking down in either of those directions, we had each other's back, so to speak, and we could say, well, remember, like this is what I think when I started to step back was one of the staff came to me. I was trying to help a teenager who was about to drop out from this program, and he was definitely somebody I identified with. And I said, well, I'm going to stay here and help him re-enroll. He was out in the parking lot. I'm like, well, I hope he's going to come back in, and we're going to. And they said, Catherine, remember, he is someone you identify with, and to the point where he was my light. He reminded me so much of myself, and I had to step back because that had to be his choice and his decision, and I couldn't project any of my stuff into it. So that kind of environment became so healthy, and being able to see ourselves and one another, but still there was shadow because it's always there. It's like it's like it's like a lump under the rug.
Well, you never know when something is going to trigger your wounds, and
right.
You're just not. What am I trying to say? Like retaining an awareness of yourself and where you're coming from and checking your motivations all the time is exhausting. I mean, right. We can only do so much of it.
Yes, exactly. And then, right, to be in relationship with other people, which this is something I learned from Michael and that beautiful monograph, and this is like one of those embarrassing things that I just learned, I think this summer, within the last 12 months, that the emotional piece is only in relationship, right? It's not in isolation, even though that happens. But that's so tricky, right? Because who are we going to find in the world who's going to give us honest, direct reflection on a regular basis, especially in a work circle, right? Hopefully we have that in our friends and family, but sometimes that's not the case. And then to find it at work or to find it in the greater field and to be able to say, excuse me, scholar, I understand where you're coming from, but have you thought about this and how this might be related to your own shadow? I'm not going to say that to someone I barely know at, a gifted conference. I don't know how I would respond if somebody did that for me. I hope I'd embrace it, but I don't know if I would.
Historically with my positive disintegration group, I've said to them, for a long time, we kept that group small, fewer than 20 people. And I would tell them, you have to tell me if I'm doing something that is, and that's basically what I was telling them. If this is coming from my shadow and you see that, please tell me, call me out. But I have to say that I realize that I don't always have a clear awareness of how other people perceive me, and other people may idealize me a little at this point because of what I do. And so I can't expect reasonably to ask people to do that because there's always, at this point, some power differential. If this is my group, you know what I mean? And I'm running it, I have to remember that. And so, of course, now I tell Emma that too. You have to tell me if I'm being an asshole, Emma. And I mean it, but it's not easy to hear things that you don't want to hear or to face the truth. these are difficult. They're difficult things under the best circumstances. So, yeah.
I agree. And I think that, right, when you're the leader or the facilitator, we get some of that training, in counseling school, around what that looks like, but it's framed in the way of sort of maintaining that post, right? And you'll get challenges to that post. But, there's a phenomena that happens, right, when you're there, because people are projecting, and it's not that they're wrong or bad to do this. We just, as humans, can sort of project up onto that person. And it's a vulnerable place to be, if you're not getting that reflection. And I think clinicians, I still go to clinical supervision, and I have got, 20 plus years. I'm amazed when I get a phone call from a colleague who's, trying to sort out some dilemma. And I'm like, have you talked with your supervisor? And they don't have a supervisor. I guess I'm judging that, but this work, you have to have that reflection.
Because of course, my clinical training came from social work. It just was made extremely clear to me throughout my educational process, throughout my internships, everything, that I would always expect to have a supervisor as long as I was going to do any kind of clinical work. And so, to be honest, I don't know if that's different in psychology and counseling, but I agree with you. I know a lot of people who are clinicians who don't have supervisors.
Yeah, they'll get their license and then stop. And I guess that's possible. I just know in my lineage as a counselor, it's recommended that you have a supervisor, and I really took that to heart. It's also recommended that you're in your own therapeutic process, certainly as a student, but as a right. practitioner as well. And it makes things, at least for me, it allows me to work at a range that I feel supported, I feel clear. If I become unclear, I have places to go that's evident or that shows up in what I can offer. But the shadow, I mean, like, you have to have places where people are going to level with you. I think those are a couple of those places.
It's interesting because I have never felt like I can do this alone at all. For me, the biggest issue was who will be able to guide me when it comes to the theory in clinical practice. And I remember talking with you when I was going to go back to working with clients about that. That was my biggest concern. But I've found that it's not the problem I expected, because you're just working with people. It's not like the theory is coming into a session exactly, and so it's interesting how that it didn't become the problem that I expected it to be, but that's because I'm so in my head with the theory that I forgot that it wasn't going to, it's not like we're sitting there in a clinical, like in a session talking about theory.
Right. You're templating it here and there, or maybe introducing something that you see that might be a matchup, right?
I was overthinking that aspect of it. And yet, I mean, I know that it would be an incredible blessing to have like some kind of supervision group where everybody was Dabrowski informed in that group.
Yeah.
That would be cool. Yeah. It would be a little bit like our study group, but all clinical people.
Oh, Chris, yes, I'm in.
Maybe by the end of this year.
Yeah, it'd be fantastic because, the practitioners, that researcher practitioner model, right? It's just really helpful to kind of be holding both, for those things to be holding hands with one another, and theory and practice. And Elizabeth Micah comes to mind. I was thinking about, when she came to our study group and we read her thoughts on sort of clinical application. I was just looking at that this morning, actually, because I was just getting ready for this call, and I knew we were going to talk about the group a little bit, like where it was most helpful. And, just getting the reminder that like the simple but not simple idea that if the tension isn't there, children will create it. And like from a family systems model, that makes sense to me, right? They're trying to sort of raise the flag or move the family past a pattern that's no longer serving them. But from a Dabrowski lens, there's this extra piece that makes so much sense to me, is if you're trying to develop and there's not enough tension, you're going to create that for yourself. And then what do we do with that?
It's funny because we keep going back to this idea of tension and how important it is. I mean, not just, studying the theory in a group, to have tension of different ideas and not all be thinking the same, and, in organizations and that, different individuals are going to come in, and then there's going to be tension because we're all sort of not only coming from our own perspective, but we've also got that tension within ourselves with the shadow. But we know that Dabrowski said that you can't have development without tension, because, as you said, Chris, like you always say, call you out when you're being an asshole, which I must say rarely happens. But without that sort of lens of, we have to be able to find fault, we have to see something wrong to be able to improve on that and to be able to find new solutions. Because you're coming from my perspective and what I do with a job, I wouldn't actually have a job in solving problems and improving stuff if there weren't problems in the first place. And for a narcissist, they don't see anything wrong with themselves. They think they're absolutely perfect. So what is there to fix, right? Where is there to go? Like, they think they're already perfect. They're never going to grow. So it just seems to me that at whatever level you approach this theory, whether it's from a personal perspective or from a study perspective or from a community perspective, the appreciation of that tension and the appreciation of being able to call it out and disagree with each other with a level of safety, an acknowledgement of that shadow, that it's always going to be there, but it serves a purpose to grow, seems to be overarching everything.
Emma, well said. I think about, I used to work in human resources management before I went back to school to become a counselor. And as a result, I do sometimes when I help organizations, I help them with some of their leadership development and some of their hiring practices. And there is a way organizationally to put together a really solid interview process. So people coming in understand what the company's about, but also have an opportunity to talk through some of this, what you just described. Like, we believe in discussing things and being direct with one another and figuring things out together, even if it feels painful or difficult to bring things to light. Have you worked in that kind of environment before? What was it like for you? What do you imagine? How could this fit for you? And then once that person's sort of onboarded, to be able to come back to them and say, remember, we talked about this. Bring this forward, versus creating like triangles, and alignments here and there, and people complaining. It's trying to get everybody sort of pointed in the same direction, at least in a sort of process orientation, right? So there are remedies and there are ways, like the organization you described earlier, that, lots of new people are coming in and like bringing things. And what do you do? Yeah, absolutely. You need to have fresh eyes. You need to have new people coming in, but to put a structure in place that allows, kind of like I was talking about clinical supervision, by having that structure in place for myself, I have the freedom in my practice to, or in an organization, by having that structure in place, at least process structure, we have the freedom then to be honest with each other and to be direct with each other. But it's not easy to achieve that. It sometimes takes a total reset, and often it takes a total breakdown before an organization's ready to take a look and build that back up and start to create a vertical.
Complaints are an opportunity. That's the customer service motto. Complaints, you shouldn't view them as a bad thing. You should view them as an opportunity to resolve a problem, because it means someone has had the courage to speak up about what's going wrong.
I love that. I love that.
And I think the same is true in like family counseling, like something breaks down, it's an opportunity. There's something trying to emerge in the family. There's something trying to develop in the family.
Ooh, I want to tie this to your book, if that's okay.
Sure.
Like what you just said is evident in your book, Raising Gifted Children. When I read it, and I think that I speak for other parents, I'm sure, that it's hard when you're reading books about parenting gifted children, especially if your kid, because by the time you're reading that book, probably you're not dealing with a small child, maybe, right? Like by the time I read your book, my son was like 14, maybe, and so I was like, well, shit. I mean, here are all these things I've screwed up, and I wish that I could go back in time and do the things that would have served him better. And it's really hard when you're a parent and you're reading books about parenting gifted kids, because you see the things that you could have done. And I have to be honest that part of what I'm saying here is informed by the fact that I have this group that I co-admin with 4 other women on Facebook. We have like more than 11,000 people in this group. And so I've had, over the course of a few, like more than 4 years now, like watching what people say. And I see so regularly how difficult it is for parents to face the shadow in this way, because you have these parents of gifted kids who maybe were very high achieving. Well, now they have a kid who they know is profoundly gifted, who isn't achieving. They don't care about school. And the inner work that you have to do to parent this kind of kid well is enormous, really,
yes.
And it's a long process, but it's really tough because, and so, but you have to see these things as opportunities. You can't read in a book and say, oh my gosh, like I wish I had done that differently, and shut down. You have to say, okay, well, my child is still here. Like we still have a relationship. This is an opportunity for me to do better from now on. and to have some grace with yourself. But I just want to say that I loved your book. I know how much, because we're friends, how much you value children as individuals, and have a deep respect for them. And that comes through really clearly in the book. And so I loved it because I thought you were talking about raising gifted kids from your perspective, which is Dabrowski informed, which is informed by your work with these people who are like legends, like Linda and Patty, and, and so it's wonderful. But I just wanted to say that it's tough.
Chris, thank you for those kind words. And I just think it is so hard. I bow to parents. It's such hard work. And, I do a pretty thorough intake process when families come to me and want to explore working together. And I do an 1.5 hour long intake call with parents. It's the only time I exclude children from the process, because I want parents to have the freedom to answer the questions I need to ask them about their family tree histories and their family dynamics, and their own journeys. But by the end of that call, kind of like the interview process I was sharing with you earlier, if it does feel like a good match to work together, we're all pointed in the same direction, which is, this is not just about your child needing to change. This is about something that's going on within the family system that the child is pointing out or calling attention to. And if we all work together, we can move this through. And almost always, which I just love about my work, is the families who call me, their children are telling them, I want to talk to someone. So we are in a place where the child's ready to go. The parents are like, okay, we're willing to look in our own inner world. Oftentimes they already are, but sometimes they're just starting. And we point our compass together and the work just flies. I mean, it just moves, and it's effective, but that's a difficult conversation to have. But I learned as an intern that during an intake process, people are more able to just answer all the questions, even the most difficult ones. And so we start off on that foot. It's very kind and compassionate, but it's intense. And then we bring the child in and go from there. And then the child is always in the loop, in as much as possible around even the parents' own work they're doing, which is like related to parenting. Kids know, like, I'm going to meet with your mom and dad. They want to talk about parenting. I'll come back to you and, let you know what we talked about. So it's just, everyone is working together.
Well, that makes perfect sense, though, that you all want to be pointing in the same direction and that the work goes well then. It's interesting to me because, like, when I was a kid, I wanted to go to a therapist, and there was so much resistance from, like, my parents and my family. Well, but I mean, of course there was. My father was an alcoholic, and, there were family dynamics that were in the dark. But there I was, like, wanting to tell people about these things, and even, like, I remember in high school talking to a reporter and, like, calling my father and grandfather alcoholics, which then I shouldn't be laughing. It's not really funny, but then it ended up in the paper, right? And so my grandfather, like, opens the paper and reads this, and they didn't use my last name, but it was clearly me. And so, like, but it's funny because you don't realize when you're a teenager that this dynamic is happening and that you're a part of this system of your family and that this is your place in it and you're doing this. And, all is like the pain of what you're living in that moment. And all your grandparents know when they read the paper and you're calling them out in that way. It's like, it's brutal, but it brings progress.
Exactly. And children always bring to us, whether whether we are their parent or counselor or teacher, they're always bringing to us what we need to take a look at. Always, 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 always. And I know it's hard to talk in language like that, like the word always, but children just bring it to us. And, parents, and I say this to parents, like, if you're not willing or ready to look at this, that's okay. It just will go down to the next generation if your children decide to have children. then they'll have to look at it, and that's okay. I mean, that's the human journey. But you have an opportunity, coming back to Emma, what you just said about opportunity, like there's an opportunity to take a look at what's happening and for everyone to grow, individually, inwardly, and collectively as a family system. It's really beautiful. And oftentimes, right, that runs back up to the ancestors as well. There's a ripple effect in both directions, but it's not easy.
It's not easy. I know I'm here shaking my head as if listeners can see me doing that.
Yeah,
No.
me too.
Well, that concludes our first episode of this two-part conversation. Many thanks to Chris and to Catherine for joining us, and also to you, dear listeners, for joining us as well. Continue your path to authenticity through the links in the show notes. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter for stacks of cool things delivered straight to your inbox. Explore the Dabrowski Centre, email us, or join us on social media. And don't forget to show your love by liking, subscribing, grabbing some Positive Disintegration merch, or leaving us a rating or review on your podcast platform.